kontra s-serqa tal-kwalità ta' ħajjitna. Il-ħadd li ġej 2 Ottubru niltaqgħu il-Belt Valletta fit-3 ta' nofsinhar.
Inkomplu bil-mistednin tagħna, però qabel nfakkarkom fin-numru tat-telefon, il-numru huwa 5210-2880 tistgħu ċemplu biex tagħdu kummenti tagħkom jew anke biex taqsu xi mistoqsija lill-mistednin li għandna. Ħaltaqgħu issa ma' Joseph K. Muscat, welcome to Ġimgħa b'Ġimgħa. Miegħu ħankun qegħdin nitkellmu fuq il-neurodiversità. Neurodiversity ħamluha bl-Ingliż, imma nistidinkom toqgħodu attenti għax forsi dak li jkun jgħid ma' dix kelma naħseb li ħadkun interessanti għal ħafna nies. Joseph, thank you very much for joining us. The word diversity is now more common in our language, biodiversity, cultural diversity, but when it comes to neurodiversity, this was one of the first times I actually came across it, and I had to look it up. But I'd like you to explain what this actually means.
Sure. Well, the term neurodiversity has actually been around since 1997. It was originally coined by Jody Singer, who was trying to understand her family history with neurodiversity. Because you see, her mother, herself, and her daughter are autistic. Okay. So it was trying to understand what autistic means and how it applies to the rest of society. So she basically, part of the definition of that is changing how society perceives the neurodiverse. So when we take a look at neurodiversity, in actuality, we're all diverse. Yeah. But some of us have some unique diversities. Okay. In particular, when we talk about dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and Tourette syndrome. They're all particularly neurodiversity, especially when it comes to learning difficulties. Okay. So for myself, for example, part of that terminology has expanded to be neurodivergent. Yeah. So I'm considered neurodivergent because I have some unique diversities, which is visual motor, visual perception, working memory, and the last 4 years being diagnosed as being dyslexic.
Okay.
And I would say
4 years?
In the last 4 years. Okay. So I was diagnosed at a very young age with the other 3, but in the last 4 years got re-diagnosed and had that added to. And I would say I'm 50% dyslexic, and the reason for that is because quite often this visual perception gets misdiagnosed as being dyslexic. So I'm not too sure if I am dyslexic, but let's go with it because it's better known out of the other 3. Yeah. Okay. And when we take a look at that, then the umbrella has further expanded. So when you hear terminology such as learning disabilities, learning difficulties, educational difficulties, or my favorite, the invisible disability, because you can't see my disability, so it's very difficult for you to understand or relate, that all falls under the umbrella of neurodiversity.
So, from a disability, it now becomes a diversity.
Right.
So there's a big change there in how we deal with it.
Yes.
And this is what I'm really trying to understand a little bit more, because, as you say, all these categories that you mentioned are normally seen as being a deficiency of something. But here we're looking at them as being different.
Right. So there's 2 schools of thoughts, and you hinted on the first school of thought, which is it's a disability. Well, if we actually take a look at it, society's been built around one type of diversity, which is neurotypical. And of course, neurotypical being the majority has set the social norms. So anything outside of that disability, that diversity, and those social norms are being seen as a disability, which then leads into the second school of thought. Is it a disability? When we actually take a look at what science has discovered and what evolutionary psychologists have discovered, and what they're theorizing now, is that in actuality, it's how we all think differently, and may have been an evolutionary step. So for example, if we take a look at studies done in regards to tribes, they found that those who had ADHD were better hunters and gatherers. Yeah. And a book recently published by a professor at Harvard, if I recall correctly, Dr. Cohen, wrote a book called Pattern Seekers. And in that book, he describes that the 21st century may not have been possible if it wasn't for neurodivergent talent. So if we take a look at Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, Sir Richard Branson. They're all neurodiverse talent.
Okay. I see. That's interesting. So, again, this almost brings me to something else I wanted to clarify. These categories tend to be something we've only recently heard of or identified. Have they been with us all along, and is it now that we understand them a little bit better, or is this a development which is a neurodevelopment which is rather recent?
Well, if we go based on what I said earlier, it's been with us for a very long time. And we take a look at the chronological history of when particularly neurodiversities were discovered. So, for example, dyslexia was originally, I wouldn't say originally, but at least noticed around the 18th century. ADHD became more defined in the 1970s. So through the generations, there have been signs, and through the generations, it's been more clearly defined. Now it's more looking back and saying, okay, what was right and what was wrong in that research and that discovery? And hence why we're starting to get neurodiversity. So, I mean, you mentioned learning disabilities. That's one particular terminology as we discuss, but is it a disability? Neurodiversity now, I'm not a big fan of political correctness, but
yes,
I much prefer neurodiversity versus being someone who's disabled.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. And this is, again, I'm sure you find enough skepticism from people who would almost term this as being politically correct. It's like a nicer way of saying dyslexia, isn't it? But in truth, what you're saying here is, no, this is simply being different.
It is. And when we take a look at political correctness, not to change topics here, it changes how we think about things, and it changes how we approach things. So if I were to be talking about a disability now, you'll be seeing me differently and trying to approach things from a different angle, and even with your questions.
Yeah.
Now I say neurodiversity, it changes. It's the same argument that my wife and I have in regards to here in Malta, foreigners.
Yeah.
Foreigners can have a very negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
I much prefer the term immigrant, because I am actually an immigrant, not a foreigner.
Yeah, interesting. You actually mentioned in your story that neurodiversity has been a struggle and a blessing.
Yes.
For you, personally.
Yes.
Can you share something about that with us?
Well, let's see how much time we have. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was diagnosed at a very young age, and the system wasn't designed for neurodiversity. The systems, I like to think of analogies here. The neotypical system is a square system. And anybody outside who's not a square, so I see myself as an octagon, is expected to integrate and to force ourselves into a square system.
Yeah.
So as a result, we face challenges. So the system wasn't built for us. Teachers, they're a product of the system, so they don't necessarily know how to adapt to someone who's neurodiverse. Then you have peers who don't understand what neurodiversity is, and then you have in regards to family members who don't understand, and you're trying to navigate your way through that. So I've had my ups and downs with the education system, unfortunately, then leading into my university and growing my business, and then leading into business. Businesses don't have an understanding what neurodiversity is. The education system has become better prepared for it, but the businesses are unaware and not prepared for it.
Right, indeed. So would I dare suggest that maybe businesses can be led to look for neurodivergent people in their staff complement?
Absolutely. I mean, when we take a look at neurodiversity now we have to understand how the complexities of neurodiversity. Let's take a look at the two profiles, neurotypical and neurodiverse. Let's imagine in regards to the variances between strengths and challenges for a neurotypical person, there's very small differences. So imagine a small hill and a small valley. Small hill for strengths, followed by a small valley for challenges, and then back to a strength. Okay. When we take a look at the profile for a neurodiverse individual, the variances are much larger. So in actuality, we're looking at mountains versus large valleys. So someone who's neurodivergent, who's very strong in being creative, followed by a challenge with spelling and grammar.
I see. So would we say that even defining and understanding neurodiversity, it changes the way we try to address it or treat it?
Well, yes, basically let's focus on strengths and let's support challenges. Let's take a look at what the education system's done to help students succeed, and let's take a look at what businesses can do to create the proper environments to ensure neurodiverse talents is recruited and succeeds within the workplace.
Yeah, okay. But is the medical profession in tune with this?
Yes and no. I mean, again, it depends if you want to look at it from a medical point of view. I will look at more of it as in ensuring that human potential is not wasted, and ensuring that we create the right environments where human potential can succeed. So if we go back to the educational model, you have somebody who has ADHD, may have been a straight C to A student, and does very well and may have got recognitions. They graduate, make their way to the workplace, and they have a hard time holding a job. Why?
Why?
Obviously, one environment made sure that they succeeded, and in the work environment, there are challenges. So it comes to management learning to adapt to neurodiverse people, creating the right environments where they can succeed. So that comes down to two sets of principles. The first set of principles is be people-centric, which means be flexible, focus on strengths, support challenges, be reflective, and be patient. Then comes the second set of principles. Create the right environments where neurodiverse talent can succeed. Again, focus on strengths and support their challenges. Remove barriers that may interfere with one's ability to be productive and to succeed. So are you providing reasonable accommodations for them, such as something as simple as Grammarly? And lastly, what people want most of all is cohesiveness and a sense of belonging. Are you creating cohesiveness and a sense of belonging in the workplace where someone is not being isolated and not being excluded or being targeted for their weaknesses rather than being focused on their strengths?
Which could be well above the average strengths of other people around them.
Now, that's another point. Just quickly before you ask the next question. We have to understand, though, there are, like everybody in life, there are various levels. You're going to have your professionals, our specialists, you're going to have your data entry, and you're going to have your car washers. It's most importantly that, again, we don't allow human potential to be wasted, and we create the right environments where they can potentially succeed.
Yeah. What about households where neurodivergent people are brought up? How can family members see this as not a disability, but as a divergence? Is this happening?
It is. And again, we have to come up from a holistic approach. When we go back to the education system, it's not just solely on the education system's responsibility. It comes from a factor of having a good household and a good supportive family structure. And making sure that the resources at home are there just as much as the resources at school are there. So yes, it's up to the parents to become educated, to understand what the neurodiversities are, understand where their child may struggle and how they can support them and ensure they have that support, what their strengths are and focus on their strengths, and to ensure that they develop the skills and coping mechanisms and productivity strategies in systems to be able to apply in the home, in the school, and for themselves, to be able to accomplish that and move forward.
This is an extremely interesting topic. We'll be delving into more detail in the coming weeks. And this is something which I too am really trying to focus to understand your line of thought, because it takes some concentration. And I invite everybody to, especially people who have neurodivergent family members, to listen carefully, because from something which could be only bad news as a diagnosis can suddenly become different, a bit almost refreshing to look at this and trying to understand the frustrations that a neurodivergent person must live through from childhood onwards.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned frustrations. You know, when we talk about neurodiversity, especially in classrooms and particularly in the workplace or in everyday life, there isn't a link. I would say that there's a marriage towards mental health.